Why is it so difficult to play older video games? Unlike every other medium of entertainment in the world, gaming seems to like to bury the past. There's so many weird legal loopholes to jump through, all preventing me from playing SSX Tricky on a modern platform. Meanwhile, you boot up whatever streaming service you want and are surrounded by old Pauly Shore films. Biodome, anyone? Free on just about everything. The preservation of video games in 2022 is still kind of a joke. Accessibility to old classics, even stuff less than 10 years old, is way harder than it should be. Unless you're willing to pull out the old chunky Xbox or a 360, you're not going to be playing Jet Set Radio Future anytime soon. And that's a shame. I'd say when it comes to this, well, new age abandonware, emulate away. But that's not perfect. 6th and 7th gen emulators are still having a bunch of issues. Never mind the Nintendo 64 or Sega Saturn still having problems. Things are getting better for sure, but there's still a long ways to go. After all, there's still a lot of really good games that are stuck on old hardware.
So yo, it's Austin, and today we're gonna be digging out some old consoles, spending a couple hours configuring old emulators, and talking about some good old video games. As time moves on, you've got more and more digital stores shutting down and games getting stuck on that old hardware with no accessibility to them whatsoever. As of now, it's already too late to add funds to your 3DS and Wii U eShop accounts, so if you haven't got Devil's Third or Xenoblade X, good luck. But this is about good games, and there's a lot to talk about, so we might as well start from the beginning of time itself. But first, I'm sure you noticed I'm looking real good. A word from today's sponsor, Cuts Clothing. I got one word for you. Work leisure. It's all about having that high quality attire that'll fit any situation, especially professional. Fall season's coming up, so that means we're out of that post-summer attire, which means we're going back to school, back to the office, and back to looking sharp, and I'm looking really good in their shirts, if I'm honest. I was mostly surprised with how comfortable and form-fitting Cuts clothing is. It's slimming on the body while feeling cozy. Their t-shirts, the Pika Pro, is great for any setting, but now that the cold's coming in, the Hyperloop hoodies are looking and feeling great. Look, I'm not much of a sweatshirt kind of guy, but this is the only one worth it. There's different styles of clothes for every type of person, and after wearing them for a little bit now, they've kind of become an essential part of my wardrobe. I mean, look at this looks sharp. The shirts are made with premium materials, so they're sure to last way longer than the other brands. On the website, you can toss together different collar types, bottom cuts, and colors to make sure you're wearing what you want to wear. There's no loud logos or anything, just a clean and minimalistic X on the side. I'm probably gonna order a couple long sleeve shirts since that's kind of my thing, and you should too. So hey, treat yourself, get ready for fall, and embrace the work leisure lifestyle by going to
Cuts Clothing's website. Get 15% off today by going to cuts.team/eruption and enter promo code ERUPTION.
Thanks to Cuts for the sponsor, but for now, we gotta start talking about some old games on some old consoles, and why not start all the way back in the 8-bit times?
A majority of games from the 8-bit era and earlier are frankly stuck. Unless you're one of those publishers that's been around for 40 plus years, there's a high probability of being left in the past. But with older Atari, Nintendo Entertainment System, and Sega Master System games, there's also the question of, is it worth it? Let's just say I don't think there's anyone out there pining for a Ghost Lion re-release. E.T., maybe for the memes, but with emulation being quite literally a drag and drop affair, these older games have a much harder time getting ports and accessibility. You basically have to be tossed into a collection of several games like with the stuff Capcom and Konami have been doing. But if you're not one of the select few that makes it onto PlayStation Network, Xbox Live, or that Wii Virtual Console, rest in peace, you might be something like Little Samson, a game whose price continues to baffle me. This is a cute little late era NES platformer, one with a lot of heart that's going to be sitting on that console until the end of time. There's countless examples like this, and you gotta be something special and get lucky in order to make it to re-release territory. It's totally random too. Did I think something like Gimmick would get some love all these years later? I had no idea. A lot of these games are good, but at the end of the day are short, maybe like 30-40 minute long ordeals that make more sense in a collection rather than a standalone purchase. The interesting part is when we move forward a generation into the 16-bit era, where we've got games made by publishers that are still around, are still prolific, and most importantly, have games that are good. Like Konami. Generally, they're pretty okay about re-releasing and making their classics accessible. Recently, we've had collections come out digitally everywhere for like Contra, Castlevania, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. To be honest, I had started writing this video so I could once again complain about Suikoden 1 and 2, but I mean, that got announced like 2 weeks ago. Did my near decade of whining pay off? I'm gonna say yes, I did this. There are games we could talk about like Jackal, which was really good, but instead, I'm gonna say Rocket Knight Adventures. How Konami has released so many collections generations. Had their games be on now 2 different Sega Genesis Minis, both without everyone's opossum friend Sparkster, is totally baffling. Yeah, they tried rebooting it in 2010, I'm sure many of you have heard about that, but those original games have just been sitting there. Adventures is a stellar platformer with a very fun mechanic of rocket boosting. It's got a crazy emphasis on boss fights, at times feeling like a rush mode, with a risk versus reward mechanic using the sword. It's got a variety in gameplay styles and level designs that's only really paralleled by like 90s Treasure. It's also one of my favorite Genesis games. I'm hoping we'll see this one accessible by kids in their cell phones one day, but Konami has time and time again been the bearer of puzzling decisions. Don't worry, we'll come back to them. When the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis came around, I fell into the JRPG hole like many kids in that time, and I cannot for the life of me understand why they never ported the Lufia games. Sure, Square Enix did a reimagining on the Nintendo DS, but that duology of RPGs, both released by Taito, are just kinda sitting there, locked away in pieces of plastic that cost several $100s, or a 2 megabyte file. But if you look closer, you see that Square Enix is their parent company now, and it's like, oh, your name's not Final Fantasy, got it. Despite all the love Square Enix have shown their properties throughout the years, they have a massive breadth of games that are now stuck on older platforms. Never mind things just from the Super Nintendo, I'm talking PS1 games that only made it as far as the PS3 digital store, which is, by the way, over 15 years old.
We could really talk about a lot, but one of the most egregious examples of port neglect from the day has to be the Super Nintendo classic Terranigma. If you haven't heard of it, I don't blame you. In a twist that you don't normally see, it was Japanese and European only.
Unless your name is Dragon Quest, it seems like the Enix side of Square Enix doesn't get as much love. Back in the 16-bit days, Enix was releasing some of the most obscure RPGs and adventure games out there. I don't gotta talk about how 10 out of 10 ActRaiser is, but when you have things like Evo, Illusion of Gaia, Brainlord, The Seventh Saga, and Robotrek just sitting in the vault, yeah. Well, about half of those games were released by a now defunct game developer named Quintet, who are also responsible for Terranigma. Do Square own the rights? It's unclear. They do own ActRaiser, so presumably, but Terranigma never coming out stateside is a tragedy, because I think it would have joined the ranks of Secret of Mana, Final Fantasy VI, Zelda: Link to the Past, and Super Mario RPG for top-tier Super Nintendo games. It came out in Japan in late 1995, too late for the American branch of Enix, who had already closed their doors by the time it was ready to release for Europe, where instead Nintendo handled it. You play as Ark, a young kid who's faced with the end of the world, literally. It kind of goes through a reincarnation of the planet in several stages, one where you beat bosses and towers in order to, quote, resurrect continents. South America was resurrected. Terranigma is an action RPG that has a really fun combat system, one with level ups, items, equipment, and a really unique menu system. It reminds me of the one from Fable 3, but a little less over the top. Ark jumps into a little box and it's a cute animation. The whole thing's just a joy. I mean, it's depressing, but like fun depressing. Terranigma kind of sits there with Beyond Oasis for me, this whole category of 2D Zelda-likes that are way better than you would expect. This game is gorgeous. You can really tell it's a late Super Nintendo game, kind of like Bahamut Lagoon. The entire Quintet trilogy of Soul Blazer, Illusion of Gaia, and Terranigma are 3 high-quality action RPGs that are just stuck in the past and only accessible through illegitimate means, and I think that's gotta change. Square Enix has been digging a little more into its vault these days. We've got a re-release of Tactics Ogre coming out, and I think more people need to experience this bizarre game. In the early emulation days, it got a reputation because its lack of a US release, and I think it deserves its heyday. So please, someone with the IP and a good idea, let me give you money? I've never had the chance. Quintet Trilogy Remaster for the PS5, thank you, please, next.
While we're talking about the Super Nintendo, we might as well get this out of the way. There's a couple of publishers out there who are better than others, but there's none worse about this whole topic than Nintendo. For every generation, just about every IP and every console and portable you can imagine, no one wants you playing their old games quite like Nintendo.
If you bring up the concept of the preservation of video games, Nintendo's like the opposite of it. Recently, they've been doing a pre-2010s Disney thing where they have this Nintendo Vault with their catalog, only releasing things for a limited amount of time, presumably to capture the FOMO market. Would I or any of you pay $5 or $6 for an old 8-bit game with modern accessibility? Absolutely. Should it only be available for a limited amount of time? No. It's weird too, because for a while there, they were all about it. From being one of the first companies that remade and ported their library with Mario All-Stars to having the Virtual Console being a huge deal on the Wii. Who could forget Wii Shop Wednesday? With rare exception of a few ports, a majority of their classic offerings are on Nintendo Switch Online, which is of course lacking in big notable titles. That all ends at the Nintendo 64, by the way. Want to whip out an old GameCube romp? F-Zero GX maybe? Get out of here. This is about as far as you can go with Nintendo too, because after the GameCube, all of their consoles and portables have different gimmicks attached to them that makes porting that much harder. Granted, they were able to do a few Nintendo DS games on the Wii U with the gamepad, but A, that digital shop's about to go down, and B, that's also nearly a decade old now. I swear, it was just yesterday I played Nintendo Land for the first time.
Too long didn't watch. Nintendo's accessibility is all over the place, but there's no timeline, dimension, or reason why we shouldn't have a modern port of Kirby's Air Ride.
Who doesn't like Kirby's Air Ride? Liars, that's who. This over-the-top arcade racing combat game came out in 2003 and gave us a totally unique concept that to this day hasn't been replicated, let alone ported. You take Kirby, or a different colored Kirby, through one of 3 game modes. You've got your standard arcade racer, the titular Air Ride, which is a decent time. There's an old school top-down mode called Top Ride. Original, I know, but the big meat here is the city trial. Rather than racing, you have to blaze through a city looking for new vehicles, power-ups, and surviving events, all to face off in a minigame at the end. This could be a normal race, a combat segment, or even a who can fly the farthest. There's tons of different things. Because of the random nature of it, this mode is something that was a highlight of many a sleepover back in the day, and probably still would be today. Heck, Air Ride was the first GameCube title to support LAN play with the broadband adapter across multiple consoles. You can take this thing seriously. This was also the birth of the HAL Laboratory checklist grid unlock system. Something that worked so well that Masahiro Sakurai said, okay, let's use this forever now. And that was that. I love this game. There's other picks on the GameCube we could talk about. By that, I mean just about every single one. While it seems like Nintendo's all about Mario Kart 8, there's something about, say, Double Dash that was so special. The 2-person system really just felt right to me, and it was my favorite kart racer until Sega All-Stars Racing transformed. Would I like to play Paper Mario, Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness, Luigi's Mansion, Metroid Prime, or Mario Power Tennis on my Switch? Absolutely. But Nintendo hates me.
What is this place?
It's a me.
Looking on the portable side of things, it's actually way worse. Very occasionally, you'll see a DS or 3DS game make its way to newer hardware, but that usually comes with a complete rework of the UI. It's also mostly done by third parties like Capcom or Marvelous USA with Ace Attorney and Rune Factory. Look, all I'm saying is that the fact that I can only play Golden Sun on a piece of hardware that's old enough to vote, drink, and soon rent a car is ridiculous. Also, Isaac deserves Shulk's spot in Smash. Just saying, I'm just saying.
Basically, you can throw a dart in any direction and find yourself a portless Nintendo game. It is totally ridiculous that a majority of the old Pokemon catalog isn't available on like the Switch or something. I just want to play Heart Gold Soul Silver without forking over whatever the heck the price is now. It was like $120 last I looked. But hey, this is coming from the same company that thinks Nuzlocks are controversial. Anyways, Nintendo's out of the way. Let's move into the 5th and 6th generation of games with the PlayStation 1 and the birth of 3D. That's right, the entire planet used to be in 2 dimensions. Now, Sony was actually pretty decent about porting games to the PlayStation 3, with a lot of the PlayStation 1 and 2 classics making it on the PS Triple, but they didn't get them all.
It makes sense considering if you combine both of these consoles in every region, there's over 7,000 games. That is a lot. Maybe not as much as Steam Greenlight was doing on a monthly basis, but still. With the newer PlayStation Plus, Sony's been actively bringing classics to the PlayStation 5, and while it's very slow going and likely gonna have a tiny fraction of the platform, at least it's something. Toy Story 2 in HD? I'll take it. We've got a long way to go to catch up to Microsoft, but I, for the life of me, can't understand why they never did anything with Omega Boost. Sorry. Omega Boost! Y'all remember Eiffel 65's I'm Blue, but I remember my console, baby.
Resident Evil, Gran Turismo, the game on the PlayStation.
Prior to becoming solely a Gran Turismo developer, Polyphony Digital would make a handful of games that, by all means, have been forgotten. Motor Tune Grand Prix 1 and 2 were 2 kart racers that were okay enough, but were really more of a visual showcase. Bendy Polygons looks weird as heck now, but at the time, this was cool. Omega Boost ditches the goofiness of that, and while still focusing on a graphical showcase, gave us a space mecha shooter that, to this day, has never been ported, which is a shame, because it's got one of the coolest open opening cutscenes. Live action mixed with CG, smarmy quips from most likely Steve Bloom, cool robots blowing stuff up, and a killer heavy rock song by a band called Loudmouth. I'm so in. Omega Boost wasn't received that well, mostly because the whole mecha space shooter genre is like a poison for critical reception. Similar to Star Fox, but a bigger emphasis on full 3D movement. It can be a little disorienting due to how fast it plays, but once the controls, the need to strafe, and mechanics register in your head, it's a blast from start to end. It feels like someone tossed Macross into a video game setting and made it work. Also, yeah, as I'm sure you can tell, this looks ridiculously good for a PS1 title. It's not often you're gonna hear bad things about something with giant space robots from me, that's for sure. I only wish it was a bit longer. I would love to see Sony and Polyphony reboot this one someday, but Dave, as far as I can tell, never mentioned it over the decades, with one exception, and that's a trophy in Astra's Playroom. Omega Boost deserves more than an Eiffel 65 reference.
Moving away from first party, this era of video games was filled with third-party exclusives and multi-platforms. Several games from this era have made it onto the new consoles via their original publishers like normal means, or maybe an IP farm bought them and tossed them up onto Steam. You never know. But for every Banjo-Kazooie or Final Fantasy doing the thing and going the distance, you've got yourself a Maximo.
Maximo Ghosts to Glory and its sequel, Army of Zen, are solid action-adventure platformers. Developed by Capcom Studio 8, a US-based studio, these were spiritual successors to the Ghosts and Goblins franchise, which had mostly been lying dormant since the Super Nintendo. Ghosts to Glory, which you can barely read because it's squished up on the box, is a very fun early PS2 title that had a bit of a strange development history. Originally it was going to be on the Nintendo 64, then the Dreamcast. The final product is something that's not for the faint of heart. What did you expect? It's Ghosts and Goblins. This joins the rank of old school Resident Evil and needing to fork over some sort of currency in order to simply save your game. It's not quite on that level of difficulty, but imagine if Dark Souls had a limited amount of bonfire uses. But at least in Souls-likes, you don't have to rely on platforming with a ridiculous Dutch angle. Beyond Maximo, there's plenty of examples of this. You've got Dragon Force on the Sega Saturn, an excellent strategy RPG that might have gotten a re-release in Japan on the PlayStation 2 and PSN, but never over here, with Saturn emulation being very poor and the price still hovering in the near 300 zone. There's not a great way for Westerners to play this one. What about Mischief Makers? This is technically an Enix title developed by Treasure that totally kicks butt. Nowhere to be seen. We need a Treasure collection and we need it soon, because pretty much everything they've ever made besides like Gunstar Heroes is stuck somewhere. Ideally one that has the McDonald's Treasureland adventure on it for the true hardcores. What about Zack and Wiki? This could easily come up from the Wii to the Switch using the Joy-Cons, but it hasn't. SSX Tricky or 3, all you gotta do is relicense music or slap some new stuff in. Heck, I'd be fine playing the reboot again. As you can tell, most of the games I've been talking about have been sleeper hits or underrated gems, but there is no reason we shouldn't have access to, like I said at the beginning of this video, Jet Set Radio Future. Jet Set Radio, or Grind if you're a boomer Dreamcast owner like me, is such a strange period piece. 90s and 2000s Japanese street culture was, and still has, some of the coolest music, fashion, and art you'll see out there. The original was a lightning in a bottle type of situation that captured all of that culture with the fun factor of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and then Future took that, evolved it even further, and gave us one of the best original Xbox titles. Sure, in 2022 it feels a tad janky, but you'll never not have fun skating and grinding around, tagging graffiti all over the city in the name of your gang, and avoiding the popo. The more open world structure of it makes things feel concise as opposed to a smaller experience that the Dreamcast had. Visually, Future might not have had the most high-tech visual prowess that Microsoft was trying to show off at the time with the Xbox, but the cell shading stands out of the crowd. I don't know. I like it. It's just a crying shame that if you don't have an original Xbox or an Xbox 360, this isn't available anywhere. Sega did port the first Jet Set Radio back in 2012, but despite Microsoft's push for backwards compatibility, this one just sits there in a dark vault, hardly referenced by anyone outside of internet gamers. And Sega Heroes. God, I miss Sega Heroes.
Speaking of smaller titles that you play in the palm of your hands, let's go to the relatively untouched world of remasters and ports with portable consoles. For the longest time, basically until the Switch, portable consoles were like a generation or two behind, with every PlayStation 2 having a Game Boy Advance tailing behind it. Sure, there were a lot of multiplats all sharing the same name, but that Game Boy Advance or PSP version was totally different. Vita still means life, even if it's dead.
It is a rare day when you'll see an old Game Boy or Game Boy Color game ported. Somehow Square Enix and Konami seem to be the only ones doing it these days with their Saga and Mana collections or the occasional Castlevania. Then there's the Game Gear. I grew up with the dang thing, but chances are no one born after the year 2000 has touched or even seen one. Which means you didn't get to look at it through a super wide gear. Let's go. So yeah, fat chance on ever getting to play something like Panzer Dragoon Mini or Shining Force's Sword of Hagia these days. Weirdly, pretty much only Nintendo's ever ported the Game Gear, and it was on the 3DS shop. With a rare exception, these early day portables are okay having games missing, but when we get to the Game Boy Advance and forward, things get a little, well, more memorable. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance has only ever been ported one time, and that's to the Wii U, which means it might as well be gone. I'm a tactics guy, I think a lot of people are, but Advance and its sequel A2 were really something special. It took the strategy RPG formula, one that's by no means innovative in 2003 when it came out, and inserted rules, or rather laws. In certain areas, you can't do specific actions without being punished. It reminds me a lot of, say, like I mentioned earlier, Nuzlocke, playing a game you're already used to, but creating arbitrary rules to make it more challenging. Both of these games, in my opinion, are underrated gems, and unfortunately, you can't grab these legit anywhere. But at least you can play War of the Lions on mobile or the PlayStation Vita store. Speaking of, Shin Megami Tensei 4, but bye, I guess. Into the realms of Persona 1 and 2 with you. How about that PlayStation Portable? Considering no device has ever used the UMD before or after the PSP, there's bound to be a bunch of games stuck on the thing. Though it was definitely the best way to watch your favorite films in WrestleMania 24. Sony's actually done a decent job trying to get these things onto digital platforms, with the PSP Go being way ahead of its time and similarly crushed because of it. When the Vita launched, they did port a lot of games onto it with the PSP Classics, and even today we're starting to see a few games here and there in the PlayStation 5. Was anyone expecting Kingdom of Paradise on the big screen in 2022? No, absolutely not, but I appreciate it. That being said, where's Death Jr.? Konami and Backbone Entertainment's silly little platformer was literally the first PSP game ever shown off publicly. Sure, it wasn't a launch title, but when I think of Sony's hype machine for this little handheld back in the day, I think of Stoned Squirrels, Death Jr., and Ridge Racer.
Ridge Racer!
The game was okay, reminds me of Baby's first Devil May Cry, but having that kind of experience on a portable at the time was crazy. Oh, and I could speak all day about how Jeanne d'Arc needs to escape. I'm a huge level 5 guy, and this fantastic strategy RPG based on the historical story of Joan of Arc hits something special for me. It's got nice and colorful looking models, a fun combat system, and a unique twist that is frankly hyper anime, but it worked. I just hope you're prepared for English with a French accent the entire time.
Fine. It's a promise. But first, we must win!
Actually, if you just do strategy RPGs in the PlayStation Portable and Vita alone, there's a stupid amount of games that could qualify. Valkyria Chronicles 2, Wild Arms XF, until very recently Tactics Ogre, but then you've got Metal Gear Acid. It's one of the rare Metal Gear titles not directed by Kojima, and you can tell. It's got the whole convoluted story and ridiculous narrative thing the series has in general, but it's definitely dialed up to 11. Acid takes the stealth formula of Metal Gear, but then tosses it into a turn-based strategy card game. The concept alone is totally bonkers, and for the time, probably a little off-putting. It definitely sounds like something that'd be your typical roguelike indie these days, but back in the 2000s, this was weird. Acid and its sequel have a bit of a learning curve that at the time was pretty difficult, but they're both bizarre experiences you're not going to get anywhere else. Konami did port the PSP exclusive Peace Walker to the next gen, so it's surprising that they left Acid 1 and 2 in the dark. We could literally be here all day for portable games that need ports, so let's get this moving, because if not, I'm just gonna start ranting about Castlevania Portrait of Ruin. Konami, come on.
Jonathan!
Anyways, licensed games, you know the spiel. When you have a video game attached to an IP, it's usually really hard to regain the rights to do a re-release. You can look back decades and you'll see tons of games that are based on IPs that are from movies, comic books, TV shows, and whatever, that are most likely never going to be able to see the light of day again. Like Batman.
It makes sense that Warner Brothers made their own publishing group for video games after actual decades of terrible Batman titles. I will say we are pretty fortunate to be able to play the Arkham titles on modern consoles, but it also sucks that I gotta do a little extra work to play, say, Sunsoft's Batman for the NES. In a time where most of these were bad, it's a shame that the good gets buried as well. Unfortunately, it doesn't matter the era, you're gonna have a hard time playing certain stuff. I think I wanna cover a lot of these in depth, so let's do a little rapid fire. Tatsunoko versus Capcom. Where is it? The Wii was never seen as the destination for fighting games, but this fast-paced Marvel-like lives in my head rent-free. Where else can you do literal billions of damage to someone? Lord of the Rings, War in the North. Lord of the Rings has a lot of good games. You might have thought I'd say something like Two Towers or Return of the King, and yeah, they should get ports, those are good games. But War in the North was something that was available before it was removed a few years back, and that's a total shame. It's Snowblind Studios' last game. They did Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance and Champions and Norrath. It's like seeing that formula fully adopted into a third-person action environment, complete with a fully online co-op campaign. I played this with friends all the way through when it came out. It still holds up. I think it's totally underrated and unfortunately now unattainable. Although some of the faces are horrifying. X-Men vs Street Fighter, same deal as Tatsunoko, but this one has supreme waifu anime Rogue. Sorry, I don't make the rules. 50 Cent, Blood on the Sand. What else do you want me to say? There's also games with historical significance like Alien Resurrection. On the surface, this might look pretty generic. It's a movie tie-in game for one of the lowest reviewed Alien films, but notably it was slammed for its control scheme at the time. Developer Argonaut Games of Star Fox and Croc fame introduced a rare if barely used control method of using the right analog stick to aim. What was back then, quote, almost unplayably difficult to control has now become the absolute standard that if deviated from would cause a ruckus. Crazy how that works. Then we've got Transformers War and Fall of Cybertron. When Activision decided to drop all licensed games, they also dropped support for these two fantastic third-person shooters, and that is a crime. These shooters are no longer playable in their co-op or multiplayer formats, not even with LAN. I don't know how something based on Transformers that released in 2010 during the height of the franchise resurgence because of the films can flop so hard, but they both did. 200,000-ish sales for what is easily the best Transformers game is not good. I would love to play this again, but it's just not possible. However, this is something that was common with the 7th generation of video games. Speaking of,
Segways. We did it. The PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 are gonna be notorious for having a lot of these unportable games, because when they came out, they were barely running on their old hardware and had PC ports that were notoriously bad. And this would be the first generation that would have internet-based barriers with online passes, season passes, and servers going down and just not existing anymore. But before all that, right at the very beginning of the Xbox 360's lifespan would be a game completely unbound to the internet. One that you might have played with composite cables instead of HDMI. I'm talking about Amped 3.
Amped 3 is a video game. In the early Xbox days, Microsoft really wanted to have their own line of sports games, similar to some of Sega's 2K line on the Dreamcast, which makes sense because EA was being EA. That gave us the XSN Sports line. Rather than being yearly releases, Microsoft was going to do them every 2 years with DLC roster updates. XSN Sports lasted a single iteration. Whoops. Amped 2 was part of that. The original Amped was an Xbox launch title, definitely inspired by Tony Hawk and SSX. It was fine. Developer Indie Built made a fun enough snowboarding game, and those are generally good to play. It was no SSX, but nothing really is. Until Amped 3. I don't know what the entire team was smoking, but Amped 3 took the goofy tone of the first two and, well, amped it up to an extreme level. Think Tony Hawk's Underground with a little dash of Saints Row, but snowboarding. It's like a teen comedy snowboarding film, but playable as a video game, and it is way better than it has any right to be. The gameplay is an amalgamation of freestyle, going down the mountain, and ridiculous activities. The kicker here are the cutscenes. Live action? Check. Scrapbooking? Check. Fake video games? Maybe insensitive fake anime? Clearly edited Fire Emblem sprites? Chickadee check. The whole story is a mishmash of different visual media styles all tossed together into a narrative that's usually funny, sometimes pretty dated, but always with a lot of effort. What other game has the Menage a Bras, a plot to overthrow the Colentronic Arts, which is definitely not EA, that ends with a comet hitting and destroying the planet? You tell me.
Son, you know we don't interrupt Daddy while he's monologuing.
This game is stupid.
There's way too many notable releases stuck on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Anarchy Reigns, Drakengard 3, Red Dead Redemption, Infamous 1 and 2, the PlayStation Classic Eco, and a majority of the best Ratchet & Clank titles are currently only playable via PlayStation Now. And that's ridiculous. But how about an old PlayStation 3 exclusive that isn't on PlayStation Now and has never been ported? Metal Gear Solid 4. If you want to play as Old Man Snake, you gotta bust out the big old chunky boy. On the flip side, if you have a copy of, say, Shadows of the Damned, you can play it on your Xbox Series X. All 10 of us. Back in 2011, Grasshopper teamed up with, speak of the devil, EA in a collab between Suda51 and Shinji Mikami to create one of the better, lesser-known games from that era. This ends up being a result of combining punk with a Shinji Mikami signature Resident Evil action horror, and I loved it. It feels like a more comical Evil Within. Yeah, it's juvenile. It's got a guy in his talking gun running around screaming big boner, but to this day, I adore playing it. It was on EA Play and Game Pass until recently, but now it's gone. Somewhere, I guess. It's similar to Lollipop Chainsaw, which I would have talked about if it wasn't recently announced for a remaster by a totally different company. Shadows of the Damned is a pretty straightforward action romp that has a little bit of that Resident Evil 4 DNA in it. It was actually the first thing I ever wrote a proper review for back in like 2011 on a website that no longer exists. The gameplay is relatively straightforward, and in 2022, nothing too deep, but the main character, Garcia Hotspur, is a fun, no fricks given protagonist that carries the experience. Yeah, and the gun. The characters are fun. I would love to see this get a proper port, and it's crazy it hasn't, considering it's literally forwards compatible on the Xbox. Everyone should experience its stupidness.
I'm not wearing anything but a smile. How about you?
Oh my god, 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 showing, showing! Now that is a big boner.
And so we've come to today. Unless you're one of those online-only titles or one of those games that bites the dust, Babylon's Fall, pretty much everything from the PS4, Xbox One, and modern PC is way more accessible. Both the newest Xbox and PlayStations are backwards compatible, some better than others, but there's that library and more of a feeling of, hey, maybe we should let you play the old games. In some cases, the games even run better. If you want to play the definitive version of Sonic Unleashed, you're going to be getting an Xbox Series X, baby. Maybe I should do that one day, like 100%. But y'all know I like to end these videos on something a little more special to me personally, and today's no different. But for this one, we're gonna be going all the way back to the Nintendo 64. Yes, I said the Nintendo 64. Extremely long watchers of the channel from back when I was super cringe know that I love me some Bomberman, and I wanted to finally talk about Bomberman 64, The Second Attack.
Oh, Hudson, where'd you go? Oh. Yeah. When I think about games that have never been ported, are really good, and are stuck on a platform that's hard to play on, let alone emulate, Bomberman 64 The Second Attack immediately comes to mind. It's the third of 4 Bomberman games on the Nintendo 64, one that was hardly advertised that came out all the way in 2000 here in the States. Bomberman 64 and Hero were very different games, with The Second Attack being more in line with the first. It's an adventure style game. You have a level select, but those levels feel like something closer to Zelda with the bomber skin as opposed to your traditional grid explosions. It's got a monster raising minigame, permanent power-ups, unlockable armor, extremely good music, and memorable characters. There's literally 7 people on music, including Yasunori Mitsuda of Chrono Cross and Xenoblade fame. You know, you're getting good stuff. It's also one of the rarest pieces of plastic on the console and is currently going loose for over $200 on top of being one of the worst emulating Nintendo 64 games out there. That sucks.
I've been wanting to cover The Second Attack all the way since 2014, but I've been waiting for a way to, show footage without it looking crummy or having that low resolution N64 output. Unfortunately, emulation is as close as I can get, and it still doesn't look very good. It's wild that my 3080 has a hard time pretending it's a Nintendo 64, but here we are.
What makes this so special? First off, it's Bomberman, so there's that. 3D adventure-style Bomberman games have something so unique about them, where it has you doing the Zelda-style thing while having to actively avoid your main method of attack. The stronger you get, the bigger the risk is, the harder it is to dodge. You do get power-ups, like the ability to manually detonate bombs in each level, but that just adds to strategy. This time around, you've got special elemental bombs. The main villains are a spin on the standard Sentai group, who are all themed after natural elements like fire, ice, lightning, which is so classic, by the way. Anytime you defeat one, you'll gain their powers like a Mega Man, and their bombs can be used to solve puzzles. It's not just offensive, sometimes you'll have to freeze things or use the wind bomb to blow yourself across rooms to solve puzzles. This one's also co-op. You've got a small, not Kirby, named Pommy, who can be controlled by the second player. Granted, AI can do it, but they're 2000s partner AI, which means they're just the worst. As you go through the campaign, you'll find food items which Pommy can eat in order to evolve, which will give it different stats and movesets, and suddenly your partner can start chain stunning things. You'd think that this would be OP in boss fights, but second attack cleverly disables your remote detonation in those, as well as having Pommy cower in the corner to keep things challenging. It's not a walk in the park, that's for sure. It is Bomberman though, so of course, there's also multiplayer. During the campaign, you'll find unlockable items and be able to buy stuff that gives you costumes for that mode, so you can look super cool like me. Can't go wrong with clown shoes. For some reason, this didn't review well at the time. I think it might have felt a bit older in 2000 when it came out, but I loved playing this and Bomberman 64 as a kid. All things considered, I think that this is one of the most prime examples of a game stuck on older hardware. And even though emulators have made a lot of progress, this one still has a ton of issues. Bomberman 64, the second attack, is an enjoyable, tight and well-made single-player experience that I think deserves way better. But it's got a lot of barriers to entry. You got being a Nintendo 64 game, bad emulation, Hudson, who was eaten by Konami, who hates making video games, and its own obscurity. Heck, with the example of maybe like 2 games in the entire franchise, Bomberman is practically never ported. You'd think that we'd see a re-release of like Generations, Jetters, Hero, or even 64, but no. Super Bomberman R tried some fun stuff with its single-player story mode, but I don't think any games in the series have come close to the Nintendo 64 trilogy. I hope that we can see them again one day. Check this out if you can, just don't spend several $100s on it, oh my god. Man, this video could have just been Konami games, huh?
So there you have it. Good games stuck on old consoles. Now, there's obviously countless of these, but I wanted to spend a little bit of my time spotlighting a few games that I think deserve your attention, or at the very least some freedom. Sorry if I made anyone dig into their closet and pull out an old brick of hardware just to play an old game that may or may not work, but I hope you had fun. Speaking of fun, I'm working on some more deep dive style videos and I want to get some suggestions. I do have plans for a couple, but I want to see what you guys want to see, you know? I like games with a little bit of a controversy, maybe a negative reception or something that's a bit overblown, but something that's fun to work with. And oh my god, I can't believe Babylon Fall is already going to be shutting down. Get your platinums quick, hurry up. Anyways, I've been Austin, and because we've been talking about it so much this time around, catch me next time when we talk about some forgotten GameCube games.
Thank you so much for watching. Special Patreon shout out to A. Vox, Aaron Kwolek, Blackfoot Ferret, Chris Shelton, Christopher Oliva, Darren Newton, Doug Prince, DX Buster, David Molnar, Elijah, GM Pinks, Hey Quiggles, Jay Roos, Jacoby Fitzpatrick, Kevin Zanowski, Kieran Arter, Nick Irving, Ryan Talbert, and Shazan. Thank you all so much for your generous support. Had a little bit of a downtime from the last video because it was 50-something minutes and I was still tired, but we're back and ready for the holiday season. I got a lot planned for y'all. Make sure to follow my social medias and stuff. I post the occasional picture of my cat and her cryptidness, trying to get her to pay rent. She won't. It's an unfortunate situation. Give me money, Freya! Pay your bills! Okay, I'm gonna go, bye.